I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Marshall Boswell, and I am excruciating alive and encaged. And this is The Great Concavity.
Is that from Infinite Jest?
Yeah, that's Joelle Van Dyne. It's a description of her right before she eliminates her own map.
Wow.
Oh yeah. Before she has too much fun.
That was the other line I was going to use. I was going to say, I'm Marshall Boswell, and I'm having too much fun for any one mortal to hope to endure. But I went with the other way.
Yeah, that's good.
You can use either
all
one.
right, future guests, no one use any of those. They're spoken for. Thanks so much, Marshall Boswell, for coming on episode 46 of The Great Concavity. It's great to have you for a whole episode, finally. It's been a long time coming. We got to talk to you, I got to talk to you at ISU in 2016 for about 10 minutes or so. We had a brief little conversation there about your keynote speaking and sort of the explosion of Wallace scholarship that we were seeing. You actually hinted at this book that we're here to talk about tonight, I think, The Wallace Effect. Mm-hmm. And we talked about some burgeoning fields of study for Wallace studies, like gender, religious studies, politics, global Wallace. But so now we get you for the full hour or two, or whatever it shakes out as. So welcome to the episode, Marshall. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I would say most of the people listening to this show are at least aware of you or aware of your books, but I will go ahead and, for those who are not familiar, give you the official bio treatment and say that Marshall Boswell is professor of English at Rhodes College, Memphis, Tennessee. He's the author of Understanding David Foster Wallace, which came out in 2004. And he also co-edited the book Companion to David Foster Wallace Studies with Stephen Byrne. And in 2014 came out with David Foster Wallace and the Long Thing, which is an edited collection about Wallace's novels. And I should say, Marshall is also an accomplished Updike scholar and writer in his own right. So you might know him from those fields as well.
Yeah. And as Tony McMahon once said to me, he referred to you as like the rock star of Wallace studies. So
Tony. That's because we went record store buying. We went to record stores together in Paris. What happened there? So.
Right. I remember you came back with your haul and everyone was gathered around and wanted to see what you bought. We'll get to music later.
Okay.
Much to Matt's chagrin. He always claims he's not much of a music guy, but it's not really true.
I think I just have bad taste.
No, you don't. You're good.
And I'll say that Marshall and I first talked on the phone a long time ago. I don't know if you remember this.
I don't.
Back when you were putting together Understanding David Foster Wallace.
Cool.
And I was working at Columbia University Press. We talked on the phone back before the days of Skype existed. I sent you a bunch of like Xeroxes of stuff. And
that's amazing.
You were like, wow, this is like the Dylan tapes, right? Because there was a lot of stuff back then that only existed, it wasn't online. It only existed in Xerox form. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I remember talking to you from my office in New York, probably 2001, 2002.
Yeah, that's when I was working on it. So,
hello
again then.
Yeah, hello again. But, I mean, that gives you a unique perspective on this, right? And that you've been around since... Stephen Byrne's Guide to Infinite Jest came out like 2001. Your book came out in 2004. Wallace is still alive at this point, still producing new work. I guess this book, The Wallace Effect, is the second in the series edited by Stephen Byrne. Is there anything you want to say about like the series or like what Wallace Studies has become now that there is like this series from Bloomsbury?
Well, just to double back quickly to the first book, an interesting anecdote that I like to tell now because I can. When I was working on that book, there wasn't much understanding David Foster Wallace. There wasn't much available about him. His biography was still shrouded in mystery, and there was still a lot of rumors about his substance abuse and various other things that he had tried to quell. So I wrote him a letter asking if he could answer some questions, and he This is the only contact I ever had with him, and he replied by sending my letter back footnoted, which was great. So I wrote, I'm Marshall Boswell, and I got a 1, and you flip it over, and he wrote hi and a smiley face, and you go back. And so he agreed to answer a bunch of questions I had about subsidized time and whether Joelle was hideously deformed or so beautiful that she kept her face veiled, and all of this stuff. And he dodged all of it. None of it was usable.
I'm sure.
None of it was usable. But I still have but they were handwritten answers on yellow legal pad, and I still have those in my office. So that just gives people a kind of window at how humble this was at the beginning when we first started writing about him. He was still a guy in his late 30s, early 40s, just starting to come to grips with what was about to happen to him. To answer your question, though, about the series, I'm still kind of stunned by what has happened with Wallace Studies. When I wrote that book, this is another story, I guess. This is why these conversations go for a couple hours, maybe. But my original query to University of South Carolina Press was a multiple choice question. I said I would like to do a book on any of the following: Richard Powers, Jonathan Franzen, Rick Moody, or David Foster Wallace, and which one? And I got a reply back saying, why don't we do Wallace? Someone's already doing Powers. So, in those years, it was still very tentative which one of those writers, in my view, was going to launch out. And I sensed it was Wallace, but the jury was still out, and I was willing to be persuaded otherwise a little bit. But the big event happened, after his suicide. I remember it wasn't but a year or so after, maybe, when Stephen contacted me. We had written to each other just as friends. We'd never met. But, he contacted me and said, maybe it's time to weigh in now that this has happened. And he was much more, I think, prescient in the sense that, sensing that a groundswell was starting to coalesce around him. But now I can barely keep up with it. It wasn't my ambition to be a Wallace scholar. I mean, it was just a book I wrote so I could go up for full professor, to be honest. And it was one I wanted to write. I thought, well, I could do this. I loved that book, and no one's written on it. And since then, I feel like my foot was attached to a train that just took off, and I've been running to catch up with it ever since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's truly a bonkers explosion that we're experiencing. And your book just came out, The Wallace Effect, of course. Jamie Redgate has a book coming out very soon. You mentioned him in your acknowledgments. I don't know a ton about that one yet.
That's a very significant book. He was a student of Stephen Burns, and Stephen asked me to
in Edinburgh, right?
Yeah, in Edinburgh, asked me to read his dissertation, and I was just blown away by it. And it took him, no time at all to turn that dissertation into a published book, which I have in my office now. But his book is about just a complete map of Wallace's vision of cognition, what he thought a self was. And I mean, he pays close attention to the presence of ghosts in the afterlife in Wallace, which suggests that there's a holdout for the possibility of a soul. I mean, I think you get something similar in George Saunders. But I think it's a pretty important book, and it's steeped in a lot of neuroscience, Cartesian philosophy, and it's just really accessible and smart. So
cool.
Look for that one.
Well,
I'm looking
with something we talk about a lot is like there used to be a time, as you mentioned, like where you could sort of keep up with the field. And now it feels like there's so many articles, there's so many conference papers, there's so many dissertations, there's so many monographs that it's almost impossible. Even if you did it full time, it's almost impossible to keep up with it all. But what you said is really interesting to me about at that point in time when Wallace was still alive and writing, and he was compared to that group of people, who you sort of compare him to in the book, or that he influenced later. And I would put Franzen in there, Jeffrey Eugenides. But you have a line in the book which I loved, which is late in the book. I think it's in the chapter about against Wallace, which we'll come back to.
Yeah.
But you said something about how, in 20 years of teaching 20th century contemporary literature, Infinite Jest is the only book that's compelled perfect strangers to lurk outside your office door wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, and that's God's truth. I mean, that happened again this year. I had a student wander in. He had been reading it this summer, but yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the only door knocking novel, I think, was the great line there.
Uh-huh.
Well, and what's interesting to me about that partly is that you state in a couple places in the book that like Wallace clearly wanted to enter into this sort of literary canon or this tradition, right, where he was so ambitious that he wanted to get that kind of success and fame, and in a way he has achieved that, right? Like, because even the forebears that you mentioned of Barth and Pynchon, Coover, none of them are coming, at least students today, 20 years after the book is out, not coming to talk about those people. So I wondered if you comment on that, to say like, was he the only one who was that ambitious? Was not Franzen that ambitious, or Powers, or William T. Vollmann? They're all ambitious, right?
They are all ambitious, but I think ambition isn't what compels strangers to my door. It's the book. Infinite Jest, fulfills the contract for the big encyclopedic novel. I mean, all the qualities that he needed to have to put it right there with Gravity's Rainbow and even Ulysses. I mean, he did all of that. But what's different about Infinite Jest is, for all its intellectual heft and acumen, I mean, it's a book that people feel deeply, deeply attached to. They feel it. They feel it saves them in a way, and it's because one of the themes, of course, is that idea of solipsism and escaping it through interaction with some other consciousness via a text. The whole Jim and Condensa wraith business of speaking in someone else's brain voice. That's what sets it apart, and I think it's what sets him apart, is that emotional core and that connection that he makes with his readers. And so the students or the strangers that show up, they don't even really want to ask me, what's the Lacanian overlap of a movie. That's not. They just want to talk to someone who's spent the 2 months on the book and knows what that feels like, because they can't explain it to anyone else, and no one wants to talk about it. Only people who've read the book want to know what that is.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the first book in this series was really Lucas Thompson's book. We had Lucas on talking about how Wallace drew from all of these other sources of really world literature, and pulled from all these other books to make his books. But your book sort of reverses that view, and where you're looking at how other writers were influenced by Wallace. And I wonder if you want to talk about where this project came from, or what interested you in that sort of point of view, pointing the lens that direction.
And this is the question I've been afraid of, because it's such a strange book in a way. But I just figure I'll just confront it head on. The first 2 chapters in the book are where the book was born. I had written this essay on prisoner's dilemma and couldn't seem to get it to lift off the ground. But one of the things that derailed me in that essay was this realization that what Powers was laying out for the novel that I wanted to give him credit for was so similar. The overlaps with what Wallace is famously articulating in Unimus Plurum and in Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, that I got bogged down in comparing them. And it wasn't until I realized that instead of this being a digression, that this would be the way to talk about prisoner's dilemma. That was the first part. And then for years I've kind of thought that the attack on Barth that is in Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way was incomplete, and it didn't quite account for how much he was borrowing from Barth that he concealed, even down to the certain kinds of fonts that he was using in the structure of that novella. So all of this started to feel like maybe I had a book here, but the one that really launched it was reading The Marriage Plot. It was such a strange book to read, knowing full well all the details that Eugenides had given us to clue Leonard into Wallace, not just the bandana and the skull, but it's everywhere. And once that hit, I thought, well, there it is. I mean, there's 2 things going on here. First, Wallace's claim to uniqueness is undermined by the number of people who were right there with him, building that apparatus for the postmodern novel that I'd like to sort of bring into Wallace studies. And then the second explosion of people who are, it's not even just influenced by Wallace. It's they are directly talking about him in their books. They brought him in the same way he brings John Barth in. In some ways, the book is ungainly because it's got this section toward Wallace and then the Wallace effect. But it's hard to extract those two parts of the argument. And again, Wallace was deeply engaged in thinking about his place and in literature, and announced it by confronting it in his own work. So it's interesting to me that people who are coming after Wallace are doing what he did to Barth in their own works with Wallace. And I see some affection in it, and I see some competitiveness in it, but I certainly see it as a testament to the reach of his work.
Mm-hmm. I love the way you put it on the last page where you call these figures in these novels revenants of Wallace that kind of haunt the text. And it's kind of a callback to, James's Wraith, J.O.I.'s Wraith in Infinite Jest, that Wallace's, ghost is walking the halls of these different books that are coming out, and there's quite a slew of them that you explore, and some that get mentioned at the end as further possibilities like Chronic City and other ones. I thought that was a lovely way to put that, the revenant idea of his influence.
Well, in those first two that you mentioned, especially the Barth with Tidewater Tales and even Letters and Sabbatical to some extent, and Prisoner's Dilemma, those are a little bit different than the other couple of books that you grapple with, in that, it's unlikely that Powers or Barth were aware of David Foster Wallace's existence when they were writing those books.
Exactly.
Whereas, Franzen and Claire Massoud and Powers, later, clearly they were. Eugenides definitely, he's in the, like you say, directly dealing with a living person, or, the ghost of a person at that point. But starting with Barth, I want to come back to that because you mentioned Charlie Harris and his work on Barth, and what Wallace was trying to do there. I think it's interesting that you focus in on Tidewater Tales. Do you want to talk about what specifically appealed to you there in terms of Wallace's influence?
Well, or Wallace being influenced, I think, is the idea there, that Wallace,
right.
So Wallace, West of the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, he focuses almost exclusively on Lost in the Funhouse, that story, which has been franchised by C. Ambrose, the right. Workshop instructor in that story. But my only argument there was Wallace's, what he accuses Barth of doing wrong, which is basically writing metafiction that does not love its reader, that is itself, it's its only subject. That always struck me as unfair to Barth, to the Barth who wrote Tidewater Tales, which is a clear attempt by Barth to now move metafiction into back to the world, where it's addressing things outside, where it's thinking about readers, and he was the shift that Wallace was claiming his generation was going to make and that he was going to make. Barth had kind of already gotten there, and I always felt like I wanted to correct that, and Charlie Harris did the same thing right before, as I was writing that essay, and it was really helpful for him to go to that same mat and explore this question. But once I began rereading Tidewater Tales, I became convinced, and I'm still convinced, that Wallace read it with great avid attention, and probably a lot of the things that he was formulating in his head about where we need to go after metafiction might have actually been inspired by his reading of that book, and that and then he had to create a Barth that didn't write that book in order to have the patriarch that he was going to kill, So, so this was a way to bring that book in front of Wallace's readers, because I think young people who encounter Wallace probably have a very narrow view of Barth as somebody to move beyond, whereas I think Tidewater Tales is an immensely rich and complex book that has a lot more overlap with the kind of post modern stuff that we now associate with Wallace. So that, part of it's affection for Barth, but I just thought there was a lot of things Barth was doing in there that I think Wallace had forgotten that Barth did and claimed as his own, which writers are allowed to do. They're allowed to do that.
And then probably later denied, having read any of that stuff, just as Eugenides denies that Leonard is a cipher for Wallace, and all these hilarious denials that we see keep coming out.
Or Wallace's denial that he'd ever read Crying Lot 49.
Yeah, exactly. Gravity's Rainbow. Mm-hmm.
Well, and that mistake that I made earlier to say that, Wallace influenced Tidewater Tales is something that David Markson deals with in Wittgenstein's Mistress, where he says, like, contemporary writers who seem to have actually influenced Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And he kind of makes a joke about that. But I mean, and also as like the timing of when that book was published as sort of a feminist contribution to the literature, I think is interesting reading with the last chapter in your book, which is really the kind of backlash that we're living in, against Wallace now.
Wallace Snark, as you call it.
Mm-hmm.
But that particular start, starting with Barth and then going to Richard Powers and Prisoner's Dilemma, you mentioned several other books that you wanted to maybe fit in there. Was there something else that was kind of in the timeline of whenever Wallace was emerging as a writer, and Broom in the System published like 1986. He went to grad school in 1985. He's writing Westward in 1985. At that time period, is that still defined? Do you see it as by those postmodernists?
No, actually, I don't know if I've addressed that I do address this in the introduction, but as someone who was alive and thinking back then. I mean, I'm 53, so when Broom in the System came out, I read it in paperback as a college student, and at the same time that I was discovering John Barth. And so one of the things about those two books, Tidewater Tales and Broom of the System, is that I read them probably almost overlap, and instantly saw the affinities for what Wallace was doing. But what was so exciting for me about Wallace in 1987 was that he dropped that book at the peak of the Raymond Carver dirty realism moment, which he addresses in Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. I mean, we now know that was the conflict he had with his creative writing compatriots and professors at Arizona, he was writing this old-fashioned, out-of-date high postmodernism. It was distinctly out of fashion at the time. Instead it was Bobby Ann Mason and Richard Ford and so forth. So, but if there's another book in that mix that sort of launched the return to postmodernism with this new kind of earnestness or sincerity, or whatever we call it. 27th City is another one. I mean, that's by Jonathan Franzen. His first novel caused quite a bit of a buzz because of the newness of its hybrid form. It was clearly wanted to be a kind of DeLillo book, but it was also a book that wasn't so coolly self-conscious. It seemed to be earnestly, about something else besides itself. So my sense right from the beginning was that they had an affinity, and it's always been exciting to think that I read those two books, Broom of the System and then 27th City, and it was only a year or two later that Franzen went to go find Wallace. Like he noticed it as well, right? One or the other. I think either Franzen tracked down Wallace or Wallace tracked down Franzen. So that would have been one, but Freedom was the one to do with Franzen, to be sure. I mean, That was the direct encounter with Wallace.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'll be honest, that's a book that I have not read on purpose. And
speaking of your last chapter here, Marshall.
Yeah, that's fun.
It's just part of my own disinterest in what I feel is, Franzen actively trying to do something with which I disagree.
Yeah.
Or something, trying to, I don't know, create characters in which he maybe then doesn't love them. And this goes back to your thing about Barth, about and Franzen's argument in Harper's about the contract novel, like having this contract between the reader and the writer. And I just got the sense that this Freedom in particular was a novel trying to prove something rather than to share something. And that was a big turnoff for me, and especially written. Part of the hype around that novel was that it was, written after Wallace's suicide, right? Like
Yeah.
he started writing it right after the
day after the second
service
memorial.
or something.
Yeah, you've got a footnote about that, Marshall.
Yeah.
And only took him 1 year to write from that date.
So I mean, I'm kind of skipping ahead a bit here because your second chapter on powers, we're kind of glossing over because there's a lot going on there. I feel like we could talk about that whole chapter for the next hour easily. What you're doing with Rorty and Wittgenstein, and I absolutely love that novel. I think it's a fantastic novel.
I'm teaching it starting on Tuesday.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Well, your students are in for a treat. So I'm kind of skipping around. I guess
That's okay.
is what I'm apologizing for is that Eugenides, the marriage plot, to me seemed partly designed to do exactly what you're saying, which is to grapple with Wallace's legacy as a writer. And I didn't feel like there was a whole lot else going on in that book.
Yeah, it's pretty glaring, isn't it?
The Emperor's Children, I thought, is fantastic. It's one of those novels that, because it directly acknowledges Wallace, it feels like that's, she's giving you a pretty flagrant flag there to say, like, hey, I'm talking about David Foster Wallace.
Yeah.
When you have a kid in the bathtub, like, reading the book.
Well, it's interesting. She's the only writer who did that while he was alive.
Right.
Yeah, that's important.
And I think there's a couple of other, that are like minor references. There's this guy, Joe Mino, who wrote a book that references Wallace. Him. But then chapter 5 is the one that's the Franzen chapter. And, what you were saying earlier about some of it is rooted in competition. It seems like that's the root of their relationship between Wallace and Franzen is a sense of competition, and in a way Franzen got that, winning the National Book Award, being on Oprah, getting that sort of fame in terms of sales and advances that Wallace never did. But is that how you would set it up? I mean, you said definitely he's the closest associated with Wallace as Franzen. Is that right?
I would say Franzen's most closely associated with Wallace as a friend. I would say the writer whose work stands toe-to-toe with Wallace in terms of its technical virtuosity and the range of its sort of postmodern legacy and its innovativeness is Powers. So, I mean, I really do feel like Richard Powers' career is still, unheralded as it I think The Overstory, which is a mind-changing book, has also become a popular one, and I think Powers is in a great place right now. But Goldbug Variations is the status novel that Franzen is so jealous of. And it also has all the erudition of Infinite Jest. It doesn't quite have, but and Powers also, I think Powers tells compelling stories, and I think he's entertaining, and his books are both metafictional and realistic. I mean, he talks about them as being both. So for me, Powers has always been neck to neck with Wallace in terms of wanting that scepter of the the heir to Pynchon. And Wallace has kind of won it in some sense just because of his stature, because of his popularity. But I would still say the jury's out, in the long term on Powers and Wallace. Franzen is competing with Wallace in a arena that he's not actually in, and I think that's, and I think Franzen's he's an incredibly gifted writer, but from the beginning, you can tell that whole contract versus status argument, although he never mentions Wallace, it's clearly about trying to reclaim his own place from Wallace. I mean, Wallace has the status, okay? He has the status. Right. The fascinating thing is Wallace also has a very intense contract, as evidenced by the people who, come to my door, right? I mean, the connection people make. So the fact that he has both of them, I think, was galling to Franzen. So Franzen creates this contract status narrative in order to split them and say you can only be one or the other, and I'm the king of the contract, right? But that competition is nevertheless at the root, I think, of that whole argument. So that's a little rambling, but I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, you make that connection with Eugenides too, saying that Eugenides in the marriage plot stages an artistic battle between himself and Wallace, Wallace being Leonard and Eugenides being Mitchell. So it's interesting that we see these two prominent contemporary writers, setting up this kind of mock dialogue with Wallace through their characters and attempting to defeat him or show that their artistic sensibility or aesthetic sensibility or moral sensibility is superior.
And what's striking in by both novels, by the way, is that the Wallace character is the sexual dynamo, and the authorial stand-in is
recurring a lot in your book.
Over and over again. I mean, so Richard Katz in Freedom, is this womanizer, and he takes Walter's spouse and has an affair with her, whereas in the marriage plot, Leonard, is just irresistible to Madeline, whereas Mitchell wants her and loses her to the more dynamic, electrifying, charismatic Bankhead. So, fascinatingly, they both stage this thing as a love triangle.
Yeah.
Well, and these all get sort of tangled up later on when you bring in, a sort of female opposition to this whole idea of literary ambition, and really with a pretty prolonged treatment of Lauren Groff's Fates and Furies. So it's hard not for me to jump around.
It's okay.
And the idea that
that's what we do.
That's what we do is just jump and go where we want to. But you quote from Fates and Furies at one point where she's talking about this great American articitis, right? And that I thought that was a great quote, right? And that the idea that is often pointed back at Wallace and probably Franzen or Eugenides or any of these guys is that they are trying to be ever bigger, ever louder, jostling for the highest perch in the hegemony. And that idea, she says, blah, blah, blah. It's you're strongest when you speak most quietly and clearly. And the one that I hear Wallace compared to more frequently now is George Saunders, who, really didn't publish a novel until 2017 with Lincoln in the Bardo. And, I wonder if you had him in mind at any point as someone who's sort of the anti-ambition person, even though he achieved a ton of success.
The original plan was always going to have a chapter on Saunders, but then...
oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
I remember Mary Holland. I didn't know what to do with the last chapter, and she said, well, yeah, do Saunders. But I didn't do Saunders because Saunders, although I can tell you, Saunders has taken a lot of the Wallace trademarks and miniaturized them for the short story and made them much more accessible. But I think what people get from Wallace, particularly in terms of that connection and the sense of ethical urgency of what he's writing about, Saunders, I think, is now providing for readers. Kind of the way Fish filled in for the dead when Jerry, went to his great reward or whatever. Music reference there, but I don't see Saunders contending, with Wallace as somebody who he has to overcome. But I think what you're saying is slightly different but interesting, is that Saunders' popularity now isn't haunted by ambition. It isn't haunted by the sense that he's arrogant to ask us to read his work. That is the Hungerford argument, that there's an arrogance to Infinite Jest that she's decided she wants nothing to do with. And Groff's novel is in addition to just being a brilliant novel, does stage her own kind of battle against male ambition within the context of a domestic marriage novel. And I think that's very self-conscious. This is what Austen and this is what this is what women are supposed to be writing, and she's written this very subversive marriage novel that's really about artistic ambition. But I do like your point about Saunders there, that Saunders' miniaturized version of whatever Wallace was putting out there is free of a lot of the resistance that Wallace has generated.
Well, and I do think Lauren Groff is in that conversation now, and that everything that she writes gets a ton of attention. But and this is really kind of like a lame line of questioning, because it's like you write this whole book about like 4 other books, and then we're like, what about these other 3 books?
Oh, that's okay. That's
totally,
that is, if anything
totally
happens to
lame
this
approach.
book, no, if the book has any kind of impact, that is what I hope happens. That people go off and say, "Oh, I'm going to do the thing on Jennifer Egan's, visit from the Goon Squad." I would love scholars to start doing more of this work. So go ahead, ask me anything about books I didn't write
funny.
about.
I was
I'm happy.
I was just about to write down a question, maybe 3 pages before I finished the end of your book, and I was like, "Oh, Chronic City really comes to mind." I did a paper on Chronic City for the 2015 conference in Illinois, and then I turned the page, and all of a sudden you've got Chronic City there, and I was like, "Okay, good." Marshall has done his homework as expected. But yeah, that's cool.
Right. So there's an essay right there.
There you go. So I'll tell you that there's, we had a couple people ask me about your book because they're interested in it, mainly for that last chapter. There's a super, big controversy around even discussing David Foster Wallace in public right now, which is, a lot of what you deal with is that it brands you as like a lit bro to even say, oh, are you going to say that this is your favorite novel, in a way that if you say, Gold Bug Variations by Richard Powers doesn't elicit that kind of response in the sort of cultural conversation. So I want to ask, is that, what were you coming from to deal with Hungerford and, to deal with this approach in particular that made you feel like, what, I want to actually engage on this and push back maybe?
The Hungerford essay got forwarded to me about 20 times when it appeared in the Chronicle. It's like your birthday on Facebook. Everyone weighed in on it. So I kept getting it, and people were asking me, "What do you think? What do you think?" And I thought, well, okay, I'll read it, and then I found myself arguing against it in my head a lot. I thought, well, and it was a kind of a fruitless argument, because the simple argument is that if you didn't read the book, you can't weigh in on it. I mean, it's simple, but it didn't get dismissed in my head that quickly. I felt that there was a sort of a larger reckoning that needed to be made with it, because I thought there's more to it than just he's arrogant to make me read this long book and there's not enough time to read it. That happened concurrently with another set of links that I kept getting, particularly of the woman who was eating Infinite Jest. I mean, I got that.
Jamie Loftus.
Yeah, I got that one.
I found that actually really hilarious. I know I have other friends
funny
in this community who don't find it so funny, but yeah.
So her, and then the person who made a bong of it, and then and I'm always getting sent the links to these kind of snarky posts about my boyfriend made me read Infinite Jest, or I'm looking for a boyfriend to read Infinite Jest with. So in a way, I mean, I as I started working on that chapter, it just became a way to get all of that together and for me to reckon with what's going on. Why Wallace specifically is he being subject of this, the subject of this particular backlash. I wanted to understand it. And one of the things I'd need to say is that this was done and over with before the Mary Carr, before Mary Carr tweeted about her own experience with Wallace. That all happened. I'd written and the ink was dry, so I'm not avoiding that. The thing was already over and it was already off to the publishers before that happened. But that fed into it too, I think.
It did.
And so,
and that stuff, part of the response there is like, well, everything that she said in those tweets was in the 2012 DT Max book.
Yeah, none of it was unknown.
Much, right? Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing I've come away with. I mean, to recommend that someone read a book is itself a kind of aggressive act. I don't do it anymore, right? Because when people tell me you must read this, I think I've got a stack of books on my bedside that never diminishes. So don't tell me to read another book. I'm behind in my own reading, right? And it's doubly challenging.
Offensive.
To be handed Infinite Jest and say, go spend 2 months of your life on this because I want to talk to you about it. So I get that. I mean, that's part of the idea of I'm going to eat the book rather than read it, because it's such an affront.
Totally.
I mean, you have to come to that book on your own because you want to read it, and
really.
So I'm fine with that. I don't, for me, I'm not one of these people who's demanding everyone read Infinite Jest, including Amy Hungerford. That's fine. She doesn't have to read it. She doesn't want to. It's just try to make an argument that you shouldn't read it, having not read it. I thought was irresponsible critically, and that needed a way to address it. But putting all that together, I thought I don't just want to say something on that. I want to actually give a full hearing. And I just thought Groff's novel was a way for just a much more nuanced way of talking about what that Jurassic vision of genius that she talks about, what it means and what is problematic about it. Because there are problems with it, and there's problems with Wallace's own ambition that, I think I address in the book. Other people have addressed them. Other people are annoyed by them. There is a kind of arrogance to it, but without arrogance, there's no achievement, really. So.
I agree with you on like all of those points. And, we've had people more eloquent than myself speak to these issues, so I'm not going to go back to them. But one thing that Hungerford, I think, implies and that you also follow up on is like the implication that Wallace's readership is overwhelmingly male.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, every time that comes up, we get tons of women who write in and say that's not true. And in my experience, like, it's kind of not true. And that, if there is, at least in the circles that we go in, the conferences, people who listen to the podcast, people who have been on the Wallace email list, it's about 50-50. Mm-hmm. And it's like, maybe is it 40-60? And like, in there's sort of separation between like the popular perception of like what Wallace fans are and like the lived reality of it. And you've been to the Wallace conference, you've met, like you say, you just mentioned Mary Holland. Like, is that your reality of it, that it's still like it's overwhelmingly male, or is that a perception that's built into that sort of argument?
It's largely male. I'm going to have to say that. Yeah. I have taught Infinite Jest 3 times as a senior seminar over the last 6 years. The makeup of our majors tends to be primarily female. Our English major at my college, and I have seen a lot of women readers fall in love with a book. I've also seen a lot of women readers fall in love with a book and be in dialogue and argument with it, and various kinds of ways in where they feel that Wallace's maleness is a problem for them, even though the book still means a great deal to them. I think one of the things that has spawned, and I think this is healthy for Wallace studies, is an interest in interrogating these issues in the text in a critical way, in a scholarly way. I can tell you for a fact that the Updike community is really struggling to figure out how to make Updike popular again with young readers, as you can imagine. And one of the things I'm going to suggest to some of the people in that community is that we need to encourage people to take on whatever it is they have a problem with Updike, because if we shut it out, constantly defending him against charges of misogyny and so forth, we're doomed. We're doomed. But I think the Wallace community has been and needs to be open to these critiques, because my experience is that they often come from people who love the work and nevertheless need to say this. There's a great moment in Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison where guitar says, "Can't I criticize what I love?" And I think that's important. That's a great line from Morrison, but I think it's important too, as the Wallace community, that we welcome these debates, because they're part of the encounter with the work, and I think it's part of the energy. The fact that someone wants to write an entire article about gender in Wallace and have a problem with it, that means they spent 2 months reading the book. And they feel like they want to weigh in on something that matters enough to them to do that. I welcome it.
And we go out of our way, as a David Foster Wallace Society, we go out of our way to solicit that. So it's not just that we're open to it, but like you say, we have to engage with that, and in any sort of criticism wherever it's coming from in some good faith. Absolutely, we engage with, and like I say, we've made it a priority to confront Wallace not just with gender, but in race and in economic status, all kinds of interesting angles that we've published on dfwsociety.org, which I'd encourage any listeners to go check out. In that chapter 2 about Hungerford, and Lauren Groff you bring up this sort of model or this idea of literary genius. And I wanted to ask you about that, because that seems like maybe a concept or a term that is tied up with some gendered idea of success, or not just success, but like almost transcendent success.
Well, and this goes back to that idea of a trajectory or a genealogy. You know, one of the animating critical scaffoldings for the book is Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence, which Wallace was deeply, conversant with, because Westward the Course of the Empire takes its way as a sort of parody of it, where the young Ephebe is confronting his artistic forebear and trying to overcome him. I mean, the whole thing it takes Bloom head on, and that the rest of the book treats these younger writers as entering into, instead of an Oedipal complex, it's a love triangle, right? It's a marriage plot. But nevertheless, this idea that for Wallace, he identified himself with a tradition, and that tradition was male. And that tradition, is the tradition of, genius, big books, encyclopedic narratives steeped in science, steeped in all sorts of different kind of discourse. You start with Moby Dick and work your way through. So, so since he chose that, he, is kind of unwittingly affirming the idea that notion of literary genius is male by virtue of the fact that the club consists almost entirely of males. For me, instead of trying to argue it away, it's just something it's an interesting thing to think about, and that's why I love the Lauren Groff novel, because she belongs in whatever club she wants to be a part of. But if you go back to Mad Woman in the Attic, the Gilbert and Gubar, they use Bloom to talk about the way in which a male writer does look at a tradition and struggles to find his place with it, whereas for female writers in that book, they don't have that genealogy. And for Gilbert and Gubar, this is a kind of freedom for the female writer, but they also acknowledge that, how gendered these trajectories are, and how women writers have struggled to find a way into it, or have created a different genealogy entirely, so they don't, they're not contending in there. That's how I read it. I see Wallace probably unwittingly becoming guilty of that, but he just saw the writers who were at the top of the heap and thought, I want to be where they are.
Yeah, and I felt like whenever you're putting him in the context of these other writers too, that they all sort of want that? Wouldn't Jeffrey Eugenides like to be in the same conversation with Gravity's Rainbow and Ulysses? Wouldn't Franzen, wouldn't any of these, even Claire Massoud, wouldn't they want to be in that conversation too? Is it really just Wallace's emotional connection that was so successful in Infinite Jest that makes him more successful, or actually achieve that goal?
Well, I think Infinite Jest is a specific kind of novel. It's an encyclopedic novel. The Edward Mendelsohn description of that genre, which I think emerged around 1976 in order to explain Gravity's Rainbow, offers a list of things that an encyclopedic novel has to have. So it has to have, it has to engage with a science. It has to use various discourses. It must sort of express the ideological underpinnings of a specific culture. It has to be long, it has all of this stuff. And you can check them off one by one. So if Wallace didn't just want to be in that conversation, he went and looked at what they were doing and thought, I'm going to write a book that's going to be put alongside Gravity's Rainbow. I'm going to write a book that looks like Gravity's Rainbow, even down to the way the chapters are split up. Even the way the font looks on the page. Everything about it was very self-conscious attempt to be part of a specific tradition. So yeah, I think Eugenides would love to be in the same conversation, but he didn't sit down and write a book as dense as Gravity's Rainbow. He just didn't, and neither has Franzen. Franzen's written long books, but he hasn't written the kind of books that you can write dissertations on forever.
Right, and I guess that makes me wonder if that idea of the encyclopedic novel has just fallen out of fashion. I'm thinking maybe Garth Risk Hallberg, City on Fire, there are a few like Sergio de la Pava, but they're pretty obscure now rather than like mainstream. Whereas Wallace and Franzen and Eugenides, they're still being published by mainstream publishers. It just seems like that's sort of fallen out of favor. And maybe that's an argument in Lauren Groff and Amy Hungerford's favor, is that that's not the sort of dominant ethos anymore, or am I off base on
No,
that?
I don't know if you're off base. I mean, but I would say this, that it's really hard to write books like that. I mean, there aren't many people capable of doing it. That's why and the stakes are that high. I mean, you can think about the great composers. I mean, for all the millions of composers, we can think of the five that everyone knows. Haydn, Beethoven, Mozart. So there is a pantheon, and part of that is just the achievement gets you there, not just your popularity or whatever. So Infinite Jest, I mean, the feel of it, again, the analogs to Joyce and Pynchon are in the books. You can trace them. They're announced. They're clear. And I think it's very few people, I think, have the not just the ambition, but can actually pull it off. And he did it. And I think that's also what's so galling to some of the competitors who write, who've written him into their works, is that whatever they want to say, they didn't make they didn't get into the club.
Yeah. This makes me think of Adam Levine, who wrote the Instructions, which came out, I think, in 2009. Matt, is it? You're reading it right now.
2010.
Right. And we just got wind through Kyle Beachy, who was on our last show, that Adam is coming out with a novel next year that is 90% of the length of the Instructions, which was 1,030 pages. So it took him 10 years, 9 years to write this next sort of follow-up. So yeah, it's hard. It is time-consuming to write one of these expansive tomes,
And I've never read the Instructions, but I mean, the Instructions makes a bid for that tradition. I think it does. Right?
I think it checks all those boxes. Yeah.
The one that we haven't really given proper credit to here I feel like is the Claire Massoud and the Emperor's Children. And I remember when that book came out, there was a sense that no one at that point had really written a great 9/11 novel, and I'm not sure that they have still to this day. But that there was a sense that like the world had changed, right? And you mentioned all of these other writers who immediately got to work. I think Emperor's Children came out in like 2006. But what was your make of it, like in that moment in time? Like, how did it fit into what was going on in the world around it at that time?
2006. Yeah, when I read it, the Wallace references early I thought were clever, and a nice nod to the world before 9/11. It just felt accurate to me. There was no Wallace Effect novel in my head yet. There was no marriage plot. Wallace was still alive when that book came out. What I read it as is this sort of Jamesian comedy of manners, and everything about it, just including its free and direct discourse and the rest of it, I thought it was just a great sort of clean, polished literary achievement. And I didn't really give a lot of thought to it until I started to cast about for other books to do, and on a hunch, I remembered that character in that book reading Infinite Jest, and I thought, I'll give this a read and see what's going on here, and I was stunned by what I found there once I was looking for it. Not just that Tubb, he not only reads the book, but he goes to Amherst and spends a couple of days in a scene that is clearly a reference to Broom of the System, and then thinking about the issue of irony more generally in the book, and Wallace's association with a kind of post-ironic novel, and all the flim-flam about the age of irony being over. I mean, that age of irony was exactly what he was diagnosing in EU and it was Plurum. I mean, he was the one, asking for some kind of more meaningful way of being in the world. So rereading it with that in mind, I began to think that she was doing a lot more than most people were going to give her credit for, and that Wallace was a bigger presence in her thinking than I would have thought when I first read it. The through line, Wallace's presence all the way through to the end of the book, I think, carries through. So.
I've not read this book, but I loved your description of Booty on page 85. You said Booty is that Wallace-esque infant, a pudgy, doughy man-child who leaves a trail of trash and spilled food and human waste wherever he goes. I wrote haha in my liner notes of that.
And see, I missed that first time. I mean, none of that would have occurred to me, But when you think about all those references in Infinite Jest to being a human as being a goo-prone infant,
Yes.
I mean, she had read the book closely,
Right, yeah. And the massive infants in the great concavity.
Well, and right after that, you bring up the fact, that Masood is, married to James Wood, who was one of Wallace's biggest detractors, and then after Wallace dies, he sort of changes his tune. It's like, oh, this guy's really well received, actually, and I changed my mind. He's a genius. He's really important, and it sort of reminds me a little bit of Dave Eggers, who first reviewed Infinite Jest in like 1996 for San Francisco Chronicle and kind of trashed it, and then later changed his mind. Right,
10th anniversary.
Right. Yeah, and then 2006, he's like, oh, actually, this is one of the most important books ever, and. I thought that was an interesting point. Like it's almost unfortunate for Claire Masood that every time she's mentioned in like a critical context, we have to deal with James Wood.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that gets old for her, but it's hard to discount. Like as a literary critic, do you see like that's just laying right there in your lap that Claire Masood is married to James Wood?
Well, and I struggle with that, because Claire Masood doesn't necessarily have to be associated with James Wood, and so I thought about this as why is the female writer here? Why can't she stand alone? Why does she have to be contextualized with her husband? Right. So I almost wasn't going to mention James Wood at all, but in that instance, I mean, I think her approach to irony was so clearly similar. Let's say it overlapped so seamlessly with James Wood's conception of what a novel should do. How it should be read, how an author should interact with its characters, and that idea of the comedy of redemption as the key to a successful novel in the Jamesian mode. There was no way to talk about what she was doing without pointing that out, and in this case, I felt justified in bringing in James Wood, and because she mentions Wallace in her novel, and her husband wrote extensively about David Foster Wallace, so it's impossible not to think that.
Totally.
That they didn't talk about David Foster Wallace over a glass of wine at home. I mean, they had to have,
Mm-hmm. Well, and what you mean about irony there, there is something about going beyond that, maybe meta irony or post irony. Can you talk about what I think you called it a blend of cynicism and naivete? Like, can you expand on that a little bit?
I would love to. I've gotten fixated on these two terms in Wallace's work, but I still hold to them as the key to getting at what is so unique about reading his fiction, and what I think George Saunders also carries with it. So, for those of you who are listening, and if you're interested in the book, there are three moments in Wallace's fiction where he uses the exact same phrase. He says, it is a delusion to think that cynicism and naivete are mutually exclusive. He says that somewhere in E Unus Plurum. He says it on page 694 of Infinite Jest, and he says it in Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. And in all three cases, he always speaks of it in that, as in the negative formulation, that it is a delusion to think they are mutually exclusive. So so I think he's asking us to sort of work at that to figure out what he does mean. So what he means is that cynicism and naivete are compatible, and they are compatible in a specific kind of way for Wallace. And the way I look at it is that under cynicism, you do have irony, and you also have self-consciousness, and you have metafiction, all the ways in which a text will call attention to itself and hollow out its own claim for realism. This is a mediated thing that you are reading, and I'm going to hollow it out for you. At the same time, you have all of that interest in single entendre values. You have, whatever Mario represents in Infinite Jest, or whatever the accountants who are so earnestly going about their work in the IRS mean in The Pale King. That doubleness, I think, is the key to Wallace's fiction. It's a way to think about what the postmodern is. It's metafiction with sincerity, right? That's Adam Kelly. So that's what I mean by cynicism and naivete, or at least I think that's what Wallace means. In the case of Claire Massoud, irony isn't this thing that you set against sincerity. For her, I think the sincerity, she's ironic about sincerity. Period, and I think she is having some fun with Wallace's own kind of dogged earnestness, which probably she might have seen as kind of an act, but I think the 9/11 push against irony, she correctly looked at with jaundiced eyes, and for her, giving up irony in favor of some kind of naive, goo-prone earnestness is a dereliction of the novelist's job to be critical, So she might be slightly misreading Wallace there a little bit, and I think maybe James Wood does as well, because again,
I agree.
So Wallace is not afraid of irony; he just says it has emergency use, But he can't avoid it. I mean, his work starts as a very self-conscious mechanism, and then you achieve some kind of connection from there. But I take Claire Massoud, she's allowed to make those interventions, and she makes them by way of the comedy of redemption that James Wood writes about.
God, and then she sort of puts it in opposition to The Man Without Qualities, which just seems like the polar opposite of Infinite Jest, in terms of engaging with the popular culture or eliciting any kind of emotion from the reader.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a neat way to sort of wrap that up. And maybe she was doing that ironically.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest way is that Tubby's the man without qualities, because he changes his identity, becomes whoever she wants to. But I mean, I think, that book opens with Infinite Jest, then it is occupied by War and Peace in the middle, and then Musil in the end. Fascinatingly enough, War and Peace and Musil are also in the source texts for Freedom. Down to Walter's name and the love triangle there, and then of course Patty reads War and Peace right before she has her affair with Richard Katz. So, what to do with that? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Claire Massoud and Jonathan Franzen are friends. I don't know if Franzen read it, but that's an interesting kind of overlap that those three texts, Infinite Jest, War and Peace, and Musil, are engaged in both of those novels.
Unlikely that it's sheer coincidence, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, this has been great, Dave. Any other questions before we wrap up on your end?
I did want to ask about music. Comes up a little bit. The band Bright Eyes is apparently mentioned in Freedom. I also haven't read Freedom, like Matt, sort of intentionally. Bon Iver and Jeff Tweedy. So obviously you've got some musical background, Marshall. Anything? Any good music recommendations? Things we should be watching out for in 2019 here?
Oh, in 2019, yeah. I mean, I'm sitting in my office surrounded by albums, but unless you want me to recommend you to go listen to The Cure, I mean, that's about as current as I am. I mean, I spent the weekend listening to Simple Minds and Depeche Mode, so I have no idea what's going on right now in pop music. None.
I have one, Dave.
Yeah.
I have one.
Uh-huh.
I just read a thing this week about an interview with Bruce Hornsby.
Okay, yeah.
And he did a thing with Bon Iver, and in his new album, he has a song called Echolocation, which he says is influenced by the text of The Pale King.
Whoa. Yeah. So he's come out with a couple things about Wallace, hasn't he? Bruce Hornsby. I think someone.
He has another song he says is influenced by DeLillo. We didn't even get to DeLillo tonight.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and the Decemberists have that song "Calamity Song," which the video is of Eschaton. Weirdly enough,
that's right. Yeah.
I think David, one of you were fascinated by the Ethan Hawke being at the reading.
Oh yeah. I don't think I'd heard that before. That's in your book.
And so another weird connection there is that I just watched a movie on an airplane of Ethan Hawke starring as a Bon Iver kind of rock star in a movie called Juliet Naked, where he he plays this guy who made this breakup album, then disappeared, and then he reemerges. But I do think Bon Iver is probably in the background of that. That's a Nick Hornby.
Yeah.
Speaking of the other Hornby. So if you ever get Ethan Hawke on there, you can ask him about that.
On the show, yeah, we'll try and get him on.
Are you aware that I actually have met him? I did talk to him once at the Texas Book Festival.
Oh, cool.
and long story, but I could tell you my Ethan Hawke story for sure someday.
Yeah, I'll get that in Austin soon. Are you aware, Marshall, that Jeff Tweedy's new album Warm that came out last year has a large essay at the beginning in the liner notes by George Saunders?
I did not know that, but I know that again, people send me this stuff, but I've seen the clips of the interview that Saunders did with Tweedy.
Right, in San Francisco recently.
Yeah, and they're clearly mutual fans. So,
yeah, he mentions Wallace in it as well.
Well, one thing I can tell you is when I was in graduate school in St. Louis, I played in a band called Enormous Richard, and we used to open up for Wilco.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
Not Wilco, Uncle Tupelo. We used to open up for Uncle Tupelo.
Oh, yeah.
This was in 1988.
Amazing.
So 88, 89. So I have met him, but he would not have remembered me. But the leader of my band, he knows, Chris King. So
oh, yeah.
There you go.
Cool. I just saw Jeff play here in Victoria last year in the fall. Just solo show. Yeah, it was great. Awesome. Marshall, anything sort of final thought about your book? Anything we didn't cover that you'd like to touch on?
No, just gratitude for reading it so closely and for giving me the opportunity to promote it here to the Wallace community. I hope people find the book compelling, and I know that it requires you to have read the novels that are under examination. It's really a collection of essays about other novelists. It's really Wallace it's a ghost figure in my book as well. But I do love all the books I wrote about, and so if anything, I hope it directs Wallace scholars to novels they might have overlooked.
Yeah, no kidding. And like for me, I haven't read some of the novels that you write about here, but even though I hadn't, you do a great job of providing enough context and summary and background in connection to Wallace that it's not really a problem if you haven't read them. I mean, it certainly helps, but yeah, it's very accessible in that way. So I think anyone who's interested in Wallace could pick this up and have a good time in it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the book is called The Wallace Effect. You can go Google it. It's available from Bloomsbury Academic now. I think it just came out last month,
January.
And if you January, sorry, if you haven't read Understanding David Foster Wallace 2, that's pretty much a central part.
Great
of Wallace
starting
studies.
point. Yep.
Yeah. So
that's something I can tell you.
If you don't have it,
I'm going to be that's going to be reissued and expanded next year.
Oh, is it?
Oh,
yeah.
Awesome.
Great. So
cool.
It's going to include the Pale King and
Oblivion.
Oblivion. Yeah. Okay, great.
Awesome.
We will definitely be on the lookout for that.
Yeah. So thanks again, Marshall, for being on episode 46. It's been great talking to you. We want to do a few thanks here. We have some new patrons this month since last episode. So we want to thank Nick Maniatis. Anyone ever heard of him before?
Yes, I have heard of him.
Yeah, he runs the Howling Fantods website and is a great friend of our show. He's been on several times. We want to thank Pierre Golpira, Dave Chandler, Cy Barnett, Ben Felony's Diamond, and Vincent Joseph Varro. New patrons, thank you all so much for supporting the show. We really appreciate it. Marshall, if people want to get in touch with you somehow, what's the best way they can do that? If they have questions or want to discover more about your work, website?
I have a website,
Twitter.
but
I don't think you're on Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter. I have a website, but it's pretty dormant. It goes back to a novel I published 15 years ago. You can find me on the Rhodes website, rhodes.edu. Dig around in the English department, and those faculty pages are available to anyone. I don't want to throw out my address on here, but they can find it on the website.
Sure. Yeah. Cool. Sounds good. Awesome. Matt, where can people find us?
I think we're Concavity Show on Twitter and Instagram, and concavityshow@gmail.com if you want to write into us.
Yeah.
We do like getting email from people who listen to the show.
We do.
And I will say also we have a few, like maybe a handful of Concavity Show stickers left from our first print run, and if anyone wants one, get them while they're hot, because I'll send them out, and then there will be no more to send out. So
yeah, that's right. Cool. As usual, we want to thank Robin O'Neill and Parquet Courts for letting us use their song and art in association with our show. And I want to give a special thanks to Laura Ewan from Bloomsbury for sending us your book, Marshall, and a host of other books that she sent us over the last few years. She's been fantastic. So huge shout out to Bloomsbury. And I also want to thank Tim Person, episode 41 guest, who had me in his class last week at the University of Victoria for their last class on Infinite Jest. They've been looking at selections from it, so he brought me into the class to talk about the show and the community and scholarship and the conferences and things like that. And I got to take part in the really rich discussion with his students, who were amazing and brilliant. We were talking about some of the AA sections that he had them read, things you learn at the Ennett Recovery House, and Boston AA stuff. So thanks again, Tim, for that. That was really rich. This has been episode 46. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And Marshall, thanks again.
Thank you, guys.
Catch me now as I say, into darkness I thought to be extinct.
Line of questioning, because it's like you write this whole book about
I'm
like
losing
4
you
other
here.
books, and you just power through it, man. Just like just like if Skype breaks up, just pretend that it doesn't. It'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah. It always catches up eventually.
We can edit it out later. It's totally fine. I'm trying to think where I was going with this is say